Hello, welcome to Christian World for Bedtime. Did you know that Roman soldiers were converted after witnessing the faith of Christians and completely changed sides? That children and teenagers demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable challenges? That pregnant women maintained their unwavering faith even under extreme pressure? This is part 2 of the inspiring stories of early Christians, revealing testimonies of transformed soldiers, courageous young people, powerful women, and how the gospel reached entire countries. Through the faithfulness of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. These stories will strengthen your faith in moments of doubt, inspire courage when you need to witness for Christ, and show that no matter your age, gender, or profession, God can use anyone to impact the story. If you want more stories like these, leave a comment telling us what you'd like to hear while falling asleep, and share which testimony inspired you the most. Stay with me, relax, adjust the sound, and let's begin. After 43 years of relative peace that allowed the church to breathe and grow, came the final blow, and it was the most brutal of all. Diocletian, emperor since 284 AD, had left Christians in peace for almost 20 years. But in 303 AD, something changed. Influenced by his co-emperor Galerius, a fanatical pagan who viscerally hated Christians, and pressured by conservative circles that blamed the abandonment of the ancient gods for all the empire's crises, Diocletian launched what would become known as the Great Persecution, a name that is not an exaggeration in the slightest. It was the most organized, comprehensive, systematic, and longest attempt to completely exterminate Christianity from the face of the earth. Decius had attempted universal persecution for 18 months. Valerian focused on leadership for 7 years, but Diocletian, 10 whole years of administrative genocide from 303 to 313 AD, spanning at least 3 different emperors. It was an extermination operation on an industrial scale, with Roman bureaucratic efficiency applied to religious massacre, and it began not with mass executions, but with something even more insidious: the systematic destruction of Christian infrastructure. Diocletian's first edict on February 23, 303 AD, ordered the physical destruction of all Christian churches and the burning of all sacred scriptures. It wasn't about killing people yet. It was about erasing memory, obliterating structures, eliminating foundational texts. Soldiers marched throughout the empire with torches and axes. Magnificent basilicas that had taken decades to build were demolished brick by brick or simply burned. In Nicomedia, the imperial capital where Diocletian resided, the great church right in front of the palace was razed to the ground while the emperor watched from the window. But the most painful thing was seeing biblical manuscripts being ripped from cupboards, piled up in public squares and burned. Scrolls copied by hand over months, precious gospels, letters of Paul, Old Testament prophecies, all turning to ashes. Christians watched, weeping, powerless. It was like burning the very soul of the community. But here's the fascinating detail. Despite years of systematic searching and destruction, Rome never managed to eliminate the scriptures completely. Christians hid copies in false walls, buried them in sealed jars, and smuggled them to remote regions. The Word of God, literally and metaphorically, was indestructible. The subsequent edicts progressively escalated. The second ordered the arrest of all Christian leaders, bishops, presbyters, deacons. Prisons became so overcrowded that common criminals were released to make room for the clergy. The third edict offered amnesty if they sacrificed to the gods. Those who refused would be tortured until they agreed or died in the process. The fourth and final edict, issued in 304 AD, generalized the requirement. All Christians, without exception, were to sacrifice or die. It was a return to Decius's policy, but even more brutal because now there was a refined administrative infrastructure to execute it. Commissions traveled from city to city with lists of names, portable altars, and pre-printed certificates. They summoned entire families. If you sacrificed, you received a certificate and freedom. If you refused, progressive torture began. First whippings, then racks, then burns, then mutilations. The idea was to break the person gradually, forcing public apostasy that would demoralize other Christians. And if you died in the process, problem solved too. It was a win-win for Rome, a lose-lose for Christians. Except that Christians understood spiritual mathematics differently. Losing their lives meant gaining Christ, so tens of thousands refused, suffered unimaginable horrors, and died confessing Jesus until their last breath. Among the martyrs of this period is a figure who would become one of the most popular saints in Christian history, George of Cappadocia. He was a high-ranking officer in the Roman army, a military tribune with a brilliant career ahead of him. When the edicts of persecution were issued, George faced a dilemma: obey orders and participate in the persecution of his own brothers in faith, or declare himself a Christian and become a target. He did not hesitate. He went before Diocletian and, according to tradition, distributed his wealth to the poor, freed his slaves, and then publicly declared, "I am a Christian." Diocletian, shocked that such a promising officer was a traitor, tried to persuade him with promises of promotion, gold, and land. George refused everything. Then the tortures began, and here the accounts become so extreme that some historians doubt the details, but the essence remains. George was subjected to prolonged and repeated suffering. Tradition speaks of wheels with blades, red-hot iron shoes, poisoning, which miraculously did not kill him, and being sawn in half. The point was to break the perfect soldier, to show that not even military training could withstand him. But George remained steadfast and was finally beheaded on April 23rd, probably in 303 AD. George's story didn't end with his death, it only began. He became a symbol of Christianized military courage, the soldier who chose a heavenly king over an earthly emperor. Centuries later, narratives about George were embellished. The famous dragon legend only appeared in the 13th century. But the historical core remains solid, a Roman officer who defied the empire and died for Christ. He became the patron saint of soldiers, knights, scouts, basically anyone who needs courage under fire. England, Georgia, Portugal, Catalonia, Moscow, all adopted him as their patron. Why? Because George represents a universal archetype, the warrior who discovers that there is a battle greater than politics, a cause greater than patriotism, a king greater than any general. It's a message that resonates through the centuries. And for us today, George teaches that your profession, whether military, medical, teaching, or legal, can be sanctified when you place Christ above unjust orders, above institutional pressures, above tempting promotions. When your boss asks you to lie on the report, when your team pressures you to cut ethical corners, when your career demands that you betray your convictions, you remember Jorge saying, "I am a Christian and losing everything, but gaining eternity." Another Roman soldier entered the history of martyrs, Sebastian. He was captain of the Praetorian Guard, the military elite responsible for protecting the emperor himself. Imagine the position: absolute trust, total access, significant power. Sebastian was a secret Christian, what we would call a closet Christian today, using his privileged position to help imprisoned Christians, arranging visits for families, improving prison conditions, even helping some escape. He was the James Bond of the early church, a double agent infiltrated in the heart of the empire. But when edicts of persecution intensified, Sebastian realized he could no longer live a double life. The decisive moment came when he was directly confronted. Would he sacrifice to the gods or not? In front of fellow soldiers, superiors, perhaps even the emperor himself, sources vary, Sebastian publicly declared his Christian faith. The betrayal was devastating for the establishment, not just any soldier, but captain of the personal guard. Diocletian ordered an immediate and cruel execution. Sebastian would be tied to a post and used as a target for archery by the very soldiers he commanded. They shot at him until he looked like a porcupine full of arrows, then left him to die. But here's where the story gets extraordinary. Sebastian didn't die. A Christian widow named Irene went to collect his body at night to give him a proper burial, and discovered he was still breathing weakly. She took him home, tended to his wounds, and miraculously, he recovered. Weeks later, Sebastian, still wounded, scarred all over his body, did something unbelievable. He returned. He positioned himself on the steps of the imperial palace where he knew Diocletian would pass, and when the emperor appeared, Sebastian began to preach. Imagine the scene. Soldiers in shock seeing the ghost of a man they thought they had killed, now publicly denouncing imperial injustices. Diocletian, enraged and perhaps even frightened, ordered immediate execution. This time they didn't risk arrows. They beat Sebastian to death with clubs and threw his body into the sewer so it wouldn't become a relic. But Christians recovered the body and buried it in the catacombs. Sebastian proved something crucial. Some people need a second chance to complete their testimony. God saved him from the arrows not because the mission was complete, but because the final act was missing. To confront the emperor face to face, without fear, without secrets, without retreat. While soldiers like George and Sebastian bore witness through military courage, a young Christian philosopher was about to challenge the empire in the intellectual field. Catherine of Alexandria was only 18 years old, but she was a prodigy, fluent in multiple languages, versed in Greek philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, and astronomy. She was a typical Alexandrian aristocrat, educated in the finest schools, with a bright future guaranteed. When Diocletian, or according to some versions Emperor Maxentius, visited Alexandria and ordered a grand festival with sacrifices to the gods, Catherine did something too audacious. She went to him publicly and confronted him, not with violence, but with arguments. She debated Christian apologetics against pagan philosophy, dismantled the logic of idolatry, and demonstrated the superiority of monotheism. The emperor, impressed but irritated, summoned 50 of the empire's best philosophers and rhetoricians to debate with this arrogant young woman. It was a trap. Catherine would be publicly humiliated, her faith ridiculed by masters of argumentation. But exactly the opposite happened. Catherine debated them all, answered every objection, dismantled every argument. And what's more, several philosophers converted right there, convinced by her irrefutable logic. They were supposed to destroy her. They ended up joining her. The emperor, furious at the public humiliation, 50 wise men defeated by a Christian teenager, offered an alternative. Marry me, renounce this Christ, and become empress. Position, power, unlimited wealth. Catherine refused. I am the bride of Christ. Then came the tortures. The most famous involved a diabolical device called Catherine's wheel, a rotating structure covered with blades and thorns where the victim was tied and torn apart while the wheel turned. Tradition says that when Catherine was placed on the wheel, she prayed and the machine miraculously broke, killing some of the torturers. Miracle or not, the message was clear. Not even torture technology could silence the truth. Finally, the emperor ordered decapitation. Catherine was taken outside the city, knelt calmly, and the sword fell. Witnesses reported that instead of blood, milk gushed from her neck, symbolism of virginal purity preserved even in death. Angels are said to have carried her body to Mount Sinai, where a monastery would be built centuries later. Catherine became the patron saint of philosophers, students, and universities, because she proved that intellect consecrated to Christ is a powerful weapon. Christian faith is not anti-intellectual. When grounded in truth, it wins any debate. Young women like Catherine were frequent targets because marriage was a tool of social control. Prisca was a Christian teenager who faced a different kind of pressure, not philosophical debate, but family and social coercion through forced marriage. A high-ranking pagan Roman officer wanted to marry her off. Family pressure was exerting pressure. It was about honor, financial security, social advancement. But Prisca had consecrated her virginity to Christ, a common practice among early Christian women, and refused. The rejected suitor, humiliated, denounced her as a Christian. She was arrested, interrogated, and tortured. They offered her a way out: marry and sacrifice or die. Prisca chose death. She was only 13 years old according to some traditions. 13. An age when teenagers today are concerned with Instagram likes, Prisca was choosing to be beheaded rather than betray Christ. Her courage highlights something profound. True consecration doesn't wait for an appropriate age. Young people can have convictions as deep as those of the elderly, sometimes even purer, because they are not contaminated by cynicism, accumulated commitments, or decades of weariness. Prisca looked at what most would consider a good offer, a respectable marriage, a comfortable life, and saw what it truly was: a gilded cage. She chose freedom in Christ, even if it cost her everything. Another young woman, Barbara, faced an even more personal tragedy. She was martyred by her own father. She was the daughter of Dioscorus, a wealthy pagan nobleman fanatically devoted to the Roman gods. Concerned about his daughter's exceptional beauty and wanting to protect her from suitors, or perhaps control her, Dioscorus locked her in a high tower where she lived in isolation. But isolation gave Barbara something her father hadn't anticipated: time to think, question, and seek truth. Through tutors or secret contacts with Christians, she learned about Christ and secretly converted. She even had the tower modified, adding a third window to symbolize the Trinity. When Dioscorus discovered this, he flew into a murderous rage. It wasn't just religious betrayal, it was familial betrayal, unforgivable filial disobedience in Roman culture. Father of the family, he had the power of life and death over his children. Dioscorus personally tortured her, a father torturing his daughter, attempting to force apostasy. Barbara refused. He then took her before the authorities, who condemned her. And in the final act of paternal horror, Dioscorus asked for the privilege of executing her personally. He climbed the mountain with his daughter, drew his sword, and beheaded her. Tradition says that upon descending, he was struck by lightning and died instantly, a swift divine judgment. Barbara's story is disturbing on multiple levels because it exposes a conflict that continues to this day. What to do when family becomes an enemy of faith? Jesus was explicit. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He wasn't encouraging cheap teenage rebellion. He was preparing disciples for the fact that following Christ can cost you more precious relationships. And today, how many young Christians face parents who threaten to disown them if they don't abandon religious fanaticism? How many Muslim women convert and are expelled, sometimes killed, by families who consider conversion an intolerable dishonor? How many children from militant atheist families are pressured, ridiculed, emotionally manipulated to renounce irrational faith? Barbara says to these people, "You are not alone." And sometimes loving family means disobeying it when it demands that you disobey God. It's a painful paradox but real, and it's worth noting. Barbara became the patron saint of protection against lightning and sudden death because of the lightning strike that killed her father, but also, significantly, the patron saint of artillerymen, miners, firefighters, anyone who works with explosives or sudden danger, because she faced the most dangerous explosion of all, her father's murderous rage, and she remained steadfast. But it wasn't just famous individual cases. The Great Persecution produced martyrs on an industrial scale. Tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands over 10 years. Men of all ages and professions, young and old women, children, yes, children, who refused to deny Christ even while witnessing their parents being tortured before them. Entire families executed together in groups, from grandparents to babies, because Christianity was a family infection that needed to be completely eradicated. In some regions, especially Egypt, North Africa, and Asia Minor, persecution was so severe that the Christian population was almost decimated. The Coptic Church of Egypt still uses a calendar of martyrs beginning in 284 AD, the start of Diocletian's reign, because so many died that era permanently defined Egyptian Christian identity. There's no way to count them all. Many died in remote villages without scribes to document them, in mass executions without recorded names, in dark dungeons where they rotted away forgotten. But God knows every name, saw every tear, counted every drop of blood. And here lies the mystery of providence. Those 10 years of horror that should have exterminated Christianity ended up being the last convulsions of a dying pagan empire. Just 8 years after the persecution ended, Constantine would fully legalize Christianity. The darkest night precedes the dawn. Now let's travel to specific regions where martyrdom shaped local Christian identity. We begin with Smyrna, a thriving port city on the west coast of present-day Turkey. Smyrna was literally a city of martyrs. Remember Polycarp? He was a bishop there, burned alive in 155 AD, but he wasn't the only one. Smyrna produced generation after generation of Christians willing to die. Why? Several factors. First, a hostile Jewish community that constantly denounced Christians to the Roman authorities. Jesus himself in Revelation mentions the synagogue of Satan in Smyrna, a harsh reference to Jews who persecuted Christians. Second, a strong imperial cult. Smyrna competed with other cities to be more loyal to Rome, so persecuting Christians was a demonstration of patriotism. Third, and most importantly, the church in Smyrna had martyrdom DNA from the beginning. Polycarp had been a disciple of John, who was a disciple of Jesus. There was a direct chain of apostolic witness that included a willingness to suffer. When you grow up hearing stories of how your elderly bishop preferred fire to denial, when you see relics of martyrs venerated, when liturgy includes remembrance of those who died for the faith, martyrdom ceases to be an aberration and becomes a normal expectation. Smyrna taught its children that following Christ can cost everything, and they were ready. Ephesus, a larger and more famous neighboring city, was the cradle of robust Christianity. Paul spent years there. Timothy was a bishop. John likely wrote his gospel there. Tradition says Mary, Jesus' mother, lived her last years in Ephesus under John's care. It was Christianity with a deep apostolic pedigree. But Ephesus was also a center of equally deep paganism. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Pilgrimages generated a massive economy. Artisans made fortunes selling silver statuettes of the goddess. As Christianity grew, it directly impacted the pagan economy. Remember the revolt in Acts 19 because of this? So the tension was not only religious, but economic. Christians in Ephesus threatened the livelihoods of thousands. And this generated peculiar persecution, not only imperial authorities, but enraged economic mobs. Merchants organized lynchings of Christians who ruined businesses. It was a toxic mix of religious zeal and financial greed, and it produced continuous martyrs for centuries, including figures like Timothy, about whom we will speak shortly. Ephesus reminds us, sometimes persecution comes not from ideological conviction, but from financial interest. When the gospel affects people's wallets, they react violently. Today, think of the abortion, pornography, and exploitation industries. When Christians challenge these economies of sin, they face fierce backlash. Money has its own martyrs too. Timothy, the young pastor whom Paul loved like a son, to whom he wrote 2 moving letters that we have in the Bible, had a tragic end that is rarely discussed. After Paul was martyred in Rome, Timothy continued to faithfully pastor the church in Ephesus for decades. He was already elderly, probably in his 70s or 80s, when a fatal incident occurred. It was January, during a pagan festival called Katagogia, an orgiastic celebration in honor of Artemis, where crowds marched through the streets drunk, singing obscene hymns, carrying idols, and indulging in unrestrained public immorality. Timothy, seeing this, could not remain silent. He went out into the streets and began to preach against idolatry, calling the crowd to repentance. Was he courageous? Yes. Was he wise? Debatable. He was a lonely old man, confronting a crowd of thousands of drunken and sexually aroused pagans. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The mob turned against him, furious at the interruption of their fun. They began to beat him with sticks, stones, and the very idols they carried. Timothy fell. They continued beating him. He died right there in the street, covered in blood and mud, a martyr at 80 years old. His body was dragged away and eventually recovered by Christians who buried him on a hill outside the city. Timothy's death raises an uncomfortable question. Was it heroic martyrdom or reckless suicide? After all, Jesus said, "Be shrewd as snakes," and Paul taught strategic prudence. Why didn't Timothy wait for a better moment, a safer context? But perhaps that's precisely the point. Perhaps Timothy, after decades of pastoring, decades of seeing young Christians falter under cultural pressure, decades of gradual compromises with surrounding paganism, decided it was time for someone, especially the leader, to draw a clear line and say no, even if it cost everything. His martyrdom was the final sermon. There comes a time when pastoral silence becomes complicity. Sometimes a mentor needs to model exactly what he preached his whole life. And for the church of Ephesus, which Jesus had criticized in Revelation for losing its first love, Seeing an elderly bishop die confronting public sin was a brutal wake-up call. Timothy didn't preach about holiness. He died defending it in a public square. And this, whether we want to admit it or not, speaks louder than 1,000 confident sermons. The lesson for us? There is a time for prudent wisdom, but there is also a time for prophetic boldness, even knowing that it may come at a high price. Discerning which is which, that is true wisdom. Philadelphia, another of the 7 churches of Revelation, had a different reputation. Jesus praised it. "See, I have set before you an open door which no one can shut." Revelation 3:8. Philadelphia means brotherly love, and the Christian community there lived this intensely. While Smyrna and Ephesus faced massive external opposition, Philadelphia seemed to have found a way to exist in relative peace without compromising faith. How? We don't know the full details, but apparently they combined doctrinal firmness with relational wisdom that disarmed opposition. They were not aggressive, but neither were they cowardly. They did not provoke, but they did not back down. They kept their door open, probably a reference to continuous evangelism and the radical hospitality that characterized the community. And curiously, Philadelphia did not produce as many famous martyrs as neighboring cities. Does this mean they were less faithful? Absolutely not. It means that faithfulness is not measured only by how many die, but by how many live faithfully day after day, resisting cultural pressures, maintaining witness, loving enemies, patiently evangelizing. Philadelphia reminds us, not every Christian is called to dramatic martyrdom. Some are called to the slow, daily martyrdom of living counterculturally for decades without recognition. And this silent martyrdom is equally valuable. Laodicea, the last of the 7 churches, received a more severe rebuke from Jesus. "You are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold. I am about to spit you out of my mouth." Revelation 3:16. And curiously, historical records confirm this. Laodicea produced practically no martyrs. Why? Because they were rich, comfortable, and self-sufficient. Laodicea was a banking center, produced famous black woolen fabrics, and had a renowned medical school specializing in eye ointments. It had everything, and this prosperity generated lukewarm Christianity that avoided conflict at all costs. When persecutions came, Laodicean Christians likely found ways to negotiate, compromise, pay bribes, and obtain false certificates. Technically, they remained Christians, but they emptied their faith of any real cost. And here is a hard lesson. Material comfort is a more dangerous enemy of radical faith than open persecution. Persecution forces clear choices, purifies the church, separates the wheat from the chaff. But comfort, it allows you to think you are faithful, while slowly compromising everything that matters. Laodicea in the 1st century is a thriving evangelical church in the 21st century, large, rich, influential, comfortable, and completely spiritually impotent. Jesus prefers you fervent or cold. At least extreme temperature is a conviction. Lukewarm? That's divine nausea. The absence of martyrs in Laodicea was not a sign of wisdom. It was a symptom of terminal spiritual illness. Pergamum was a completely different case. Jesus called it the place where Satan's throne is, Revelation 2:13. Strong language that likely referred to the fact that Pergamum was a center of imperial worship in Asia Minor. There was a giant altar to Zeus on the Acropolis, the throne, temples dedicated to deified emperors, and an oppressively pagan spiritual atmosphere. Christians in Pergamum literally lived in the shadow of institutionalized demonic power. It wasn't like cities where paganism was cultural but decentralized. In Pergamum, it was concentrated, official, omnipresent. And that meant Christians couldn't be discreet. Refusing imperial worship there was a direct insult to the city's central authority. So Pergamum produced constant martyrs, including Antipas, about whom Jesus specifically commented, "Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells." Revelation 2:13. This verse is fascinating because Jesus validated Antipas's martyrdom by name, the only individual martyr mentioned by name in Revelation. This suggests that Antipas was an extraordinarily important figure, whose testimony reverberated throughout the region, and tradition has preserved horrific details of how he died, which we will see next. Antipas was bishop of Pergamum during the reign of Domitian, probably the 90s AD, the emperor who demanded to be called Lord and God. In Pergamum, where imperial worship was a major industry, pressure on Christians was intolerable. Antipas not only refused to sacrifice, he actively preached against idolatry, converting pagans and thus stealing worshippers from the local gods. Pagan priests eventually arrested him and brought him before the authorities. They offered him a standard choice: sacrifice or die. Antipas replied, according to tradition, "I sacrifice myself daily to my God, whom I worship. You will not make me sacrifice to demons." The chosen execution was particularly diabolical. They built a hollow bronze statue in the shape of a bull, lit a massive fire underneath until the metal was incandescent, and stuffed Antipas inside. It was literally being roasted alive inside a pagan idol, perverse symbolism forcing a martyr to enter the very God he refused to worship. Antipas's cries echoed through the city as he was slowly cooked to death. But Christian witnesses reported that he continued praying and praising until he lost consciousness. His body was recovered and buried in Pergamum, where it became a venerated relic. Antipas proved that even on Satan's throne, Christ reigns through faithful witnesses. The pattern is clear. Smyrna and Pergamum, cities with more intense spiritual opposition, produced more martyrs than relatively easier cities. Why? Because spiritual warfare is real, not a metaphor. There are places where demonic presence is more concentrated, where power structures are more directly aligned with darkness. And in these places, Christians face proportionally more violent resistance. Think of countries today: North Korea, Somalia, Afghanistan, parts of the Middle East and Africa. They are modern-day Pergamums, places where martyrdom is a regular statistic, not an exception. Meanwhile, Christians in comfortable secularized societies are modern-day Laodiceans, facing cultural opposition but rarely physical violence. And here's the uncomfortable question: were Christians in Pergamum, Smyrna, more faithful than those in Laodicea, Philadelphia? Not necessarily, but they were, tested more intensely. Untested faith remains hypothetical. You think you believe, but you don't really know until you're pressed. Martyrdom doesn't create faith. It reveals and purifies faith that already exists. And perhaps, just perhaps, Christians in easy contexts should stop giving thanks for comfort and start asking for tests that prove whether faith is real or illusory. But these communities in Asia Minor not only produced martyrs, they developed theology of martyrdom through figures like Ignatius, who passed through there on his way to Rome, and John, who pastored Ephesus and wrote Revelation on Patmos. Asian churches articulated a profound understanding of Christian suffering. It wasn't masochism, seeking pain for pain's sake. It wasn't fatalism. We're going to die, there's nothing to be done. It was a theology of participation in the sufferings of Christ, a mystical union with the crucified one that transforms apparent defeat into cosmic victory. Paul had written, "I am now filling up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions," Colossians 1:24, a concept that the Asian churches lived it literally. Each martyr was an extension of the cross of Christ in time and space, representing, not repeating, Jesus' unique sacrifice in a new generation and place. It was sacramental, like bread and wine. Present body and blood of Christ. Martyr it presents, the death of Christ. And Revelation, written for these persecuted churches, provided a cosmology that made sense of suffering. The Lamb who was slain is on the throne. The martyrs reign with him. Babylon, Rome, will fall. The New Jerusalem will descend. Present suffering is real but temporary. Future victory is certain and eternal. This theology sustained generations of Asian Christians through centuries of intermittent persecution until Constantine. Alexandria was not only the second largest urban center in the empire after Rome, it was the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The famous Library of Alexandria, the museum, research center, philosophical schools competing for brilliant students. And when Christianity arrived there, it didn't come as a religion of ignorant peasants. it came as a robust intellectual force. The catechetical school of Alexandria produced giants like Clement, Origen, Athanasius, theologians who could debate pagan philosophers on equal terms and win. But this intellectual sophistication did not protect against persecution. Sometimes it even intensified it because Alexandrian Christians challenged paganism in the realm of ideas, not just practice. And Alexandria had a dangerous demographic peculiarity. A huge and hostile Jewish population, pagan Greeks proud of their philosophical tradition, native Egyptians clinging to ancient, millennia-old religions. It was a melting pot of ethnic and religious tensions where Christians were a vulnerable minority attacked from all sides. So Alexandria became a city of paradoxes. It produced the most sophisticated Christian theology and some of the most brutal martyrdoms. Intellect and blood, philosophy and bonfires coexisted in the same narrow streets. Leonidas, Origen's father, we've mentioned before, but it's worth revisiting because he set the standard for Alexandrian martyrdom. He wasn't a famous theologian, nor a bishop or prominent ecclesiastical leader. He was a family man, a catechist, an ordinary man teaching Christianity at home. But under Septimius Severus's edict prohibiting conversion and Christian teaching, that was enough for a death sentence. He was beheaded in 202 AD, leaving a widow and 7 children in utter poverty, possessed property. Origen, at 17, wanted to die with him, but was prevented by his mother hiding his clothes. That formative trauma shaped Origen. He dedicated his entire life to compensating for not having died young, living in extreme asceticism, constantly risking his life until finally being tortured in Decius persecution decades later. Leonidas's lesson. Martyrdom doesn't require fame or position. It only requires faithfulness in the place where God has put you. He wasn't important by human standards, but his death changed history through his son who survived, learned, and taught millions throughout the centuries via preserved writings. Potamiana was a young Christian slave in Alexandria, owned by a master who desired her sexually. When she repeatedly refused his advances, he became enraged, not only by the rejection but by the humiliation of being refused. Slave, he denounced her as a Christian. She was arrested, tried, and condemned. The chosen execution method was particularly horrific, a giant cauldron filled with boiling pitch, bitumen, into which she would be slowly immersed, starting with her feet and gradually rising to her head. It was a 3-hour torture, not a quick execution. The soldier in charge was Basilides, an order taker, a doer of dirty work. But while escorting Potamiana to execution, something extraordinary happened. She treated him with kindness, spoke of Christ, and prayed for him. Basilides, perhaps for the first time treated as a human being instead of a tool of violence, was deeply disturbed. He watched her die with supernatural courage, singing as the pitch melted flesh from her bones, and that broke something within him. Days later, Basilides publicly declared himself a Christian. He too was executed, baptized in his own blood. The conversion of Basilides illustrates a recurring pattern that perplexed Roman authorities. Executioners converting through the very executions they carried out. It was an operational paradox. The more Christians they killed, the more new Christians they created among the killers. Imagine being a soldier assigned to execute dangerous criminals and discovering that they are kind people praying for you while you torture them. Imagine seeing a young mother forgive you while preparing the bonfire that will burn her. Imagine hearing an elder thank God for the crown of glory seconds before you behead him. This cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Soldiers were trained to see enemies as subhuman, facilitating violence. But Christians refused to be dehumanized. They treated executioners as people created in the image of God, literally loved their enemies, prayed for persecutors in the moment of maximum persecution. And this disarmed hatred, penetrated psychological armor, planted seeds that later germinated into conversion. Basilides was no exception. He was an example of a phenomenon that authorities did not know how to combat. How do you intimidate people who turn torture chambers into evangelistic opportunities? Carthage, a port city in North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, has already been seen as the setting for the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity under Septimius Severus, and later of Cyprian under Valerian. But Carthage was more than just a stage for individual martyrdoms. It was a center of theological reflection on martyrdom. Tertullian, a brilliant converted lawyer who wrote in Carthage, coined a phrase that would forever define the Christian perspective. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The seed is the blood of Christians. This wasn't poetry, it was empirical observation. Tertullian saw a clear pattern. Each wave of persecution that should have diminished the church numerically ended up increasing it. Why? Because testimony authenticated by blood was propaganda impossible to refute. Pagan philosophers could debate theology, but they had no answer for the supernatural courage of martyrs. Why do they die like that? Was a question that tormented the curious, inevitably leading them to the gospel. Carthage understood. Martyrdom was not a waste of life, it was the supreme evangelistic investment. A courageous death could convert hundreds. It was the mathematics of the kingdom. Losing life was multiplying it exponentially. Cyprian of Carthage was not only a martyr, he was a theologian of martyrdom. During the years between his conversion and execution, he wrote treatises exploring the spiritual meaning of suffering for Christ. Two Fortunatus for Fortunato compiled biblical passages about perseverance under persecution. Of Mortality on Mortality comforted Christians terrified by plagues and death, arguing that death is no enemy to those who have eternal life. About Falls on the Fallen dealt pastorally with the crisis of those who apostatized under torture. Cyprian did not theorize in a vacuum. He wrote for a community that was literally bleeding, needing practical and theological guidance. And when his turn came in 258 AD, he modeled everything he wrote. He walked serenely to his execution, gave money to the executioner, blindfolded himself, knelt, and awaited the sword. Theory became praxis, words became flesh. And that final consistency, living what he preached until he literally lost his head for it, authenticated his entire ministry retroactively. Cyprian not only spoke of a crown of martyrdom, he wore it. Numidia, a mountainous region roughly corresponding to present-day Algeria, was a more rural and less Romanized area of North Africa. While Carthage and Alexandria were cosmopolitan metropolises, Numidia had Berber villages, where Christianity grew among the native population, not just Roman colonists. And during Diocletian's great persecution, Numidia bled especially hard. Why? Because rural communities were easier to control. Authorities could surround entire villages, force everyone to sacrifice simultaneously, execute resistors without urban witnesses complicating the narrative. Accounts speak of entire churches burned with congregations locked inside, families executed en masse in village squares, bishops dragged to death by horses. It was localized genocide, less documented than urban martyrdoms, but equally brutal. Numidia produced martyrs whose names we will never know, shepherds who refused to sacrifice, Berber women who hid scriptures, children who sang hymns as they were killed. Anonymous, but not forgotten by God. Every drop of blood spilled in the remote mountains of Numidia counted as much as blood spilled in the arenas of Rome. North Africa developed a theology of martyrdom perhaps more robust than any other region of the empire. Why? A combination of factors: Stoic philosophical tradition, which valued courage in the face of suffering; Jewish influence, Maccabean martyrs as models; intense and prolonged persecution, forcing deep reflection; and brilliant intellectual leaders who could articulate experience theologically: Tertullian, Cyprian, Origen, Athanasius. The result was a sophisticated understanding. Martyrdom as imitation of Christ, as baptism of blood when baptism of water was impossible, as a guarantee of immediate salvation. Martyrs went straight to paradise, skipping purgatory; as priesthood, offering one's own body as a living sacrifice. It was not glorification of suffering, it was the transformation of suffering into an act of worship. And this theology traveled. When North African missionaries took the gospel to Europe, they also carried this profound understanding that following Christ may cost everything, but is infinitely more valuable than everything. North Africa taught the universal church to bleed with purpose. But not everything was theological harmony. From the crisis of child who apostatized under pressure, a controversy emerged: that would tear the North African church apart: Donatism. After the Great Persecution ended, the urgent question was, bishops and clergy who handed over scriptures to the authorities to be burned, called traitors, could traitors continue in ministry? Donatists said absolutely not. Traitors had lost sacramental grace, so sacraments administered by them, baptism, Eucharist, ordination, were invalid. The true church was only for the pure, for those who resisted. Catholics, led by Augustine later, argued, sacramental validity does not depend on the holiness of the minister, but on Christ. The church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum of saints. Mercy is possible even for traitors, repentant. The debate became bitter, sometimes violent, dividing communities. Donatists were ironically heirs of the martyrs, taking their zeal to a legalistic extreme, but they lost something crucial that martyrs understood: grace. Perpetua prayed for executioners. Donatists condemned fallen brethren. It is a tension that persists: how to balance purity and mercy, holiness and grace, firmness and compassion. North Africa struggled with this and never fully resolved it before Islam conquered the region in the 7th century. Now we cross the Mediterranean back to Rome, the heart of the empire, the capital of power, the center of everything. If martyrdom was rare in Laodicea because it was comfortable, martyrdom was frequent in Rome because it was inevitable. Rome was where emperors resided, the Senate met, the army reported, and laws were made. It was a stage where the empire demonstrated power through violent public spectacle. Gladiators, executions, military triumphs. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators. The Circus Maximus held 150,000. Roman entertainment was synonymous with violence, and Christians became part of that entertainment regularly. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about pedagogical spectacle. Publicly executing Christians taught a lesson. See what happens to those who defy Rome. But as always, the lesson taught the opposite of what was intended. Crowds came expecting to see cowards begging. They left disturbed seeing incomprehensible courage. Rome produced more martyrs than any other city because it was a bigger stage with a bigger audience. And ironically, each execution was an unintentional commercial for the gospel, broadcast to thousands simultaneously. The catacombs of Rome, networks of underground tunnels that extend for hundreds of kilometers beneath the city, began as cemeteries. Roman law prohibited burials within city walls, a matter of public health. So poor Christians who could not afford private plots dug tunnels into soft volcanic rock, creating niches, burial niches, where they placed bodies wrapped in sheets. But during persecutions, catacombs served an additional function: refuge and clandestine place of worship. It was difficult for authorities to monitor the underground labyrinth with multiple hidden entrances, so Christians gathered there, literally surrounded by the bones of martyrs, to celebrate the Eucharist, baptize converts, and teach catechumens. It was liturgy in the cemetery, worship among the dead. And far from being morbid, it was incarnate theology. You are dead, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Colossians 3:3. The catacombs said, "The world thinks we are dead, but we are more alive than ever. Verily, the dead lie above ground, worshipping lifeless idols. We, surrounded by corpses, live because Christ lives." Today you can visit catacombs and see early Christian art: Good Shepherd, fish, anchor, bread and wine, symbols of hope scribbled by people marked for death. Peter and Paul, we've explored their deaths extensively, but it's worth emphasizing their specific significance for Rome. They were martyrs, foundational of the Roman Church, not in the sense of being the first Christians there, the community existed before they arrived, but in the sense of authenticating the Roman Church with apostolic blood. Peter, leader of the 12, crucified upside down, probably in Nero's circus. Paul, apostle to the Gentiles, beheaded on the Via Ostiense. Two giants of early Christianity, killed in Rome months apart, both under Nero, and Rome never forgot. Tradition located their tombs: Peter under what is now St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, Paul under the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century found substantial evidence validating traditions. But beyond history, there is theology. The Church of Rome claimed special authority based in part on being the church of the two main martyred apostles. Apostolic succession was not just theoretical, it was literally buried under Roman soil. Peter and Paul died, but through that death, they planted a church that would eventually convert the entire empire. Nero thought he was eliminating problematic Christian leaders. He was unknowingly sanctifying the ground that would become the capital of world Christianity. Lawrence of Rome, the deacon whose death on the gridiron we have already detailed, deserves mention here because he embodies something unique about Roman martyrdom: brutal creativity in executions. Rome was not content with simple methods. It invented theatricality. Lawrence was not merely killed, he was slowly roasted as a public performance. The gridiron was raised so the audience could see clearly. Fire was controlled to prolong agony, not to kill quickly. It was torture spectacle, simultaneously satisfying revenge, intimidation, and entertainment. But as always, Rome underestimated its adversary. Lawrence transformed execution into a pulpit, torture into testimony, agony into apologetics. When he said, "Turn me over, I'm roasted on this side," and he wasn't just making a macabre joke, he was mocking Rome's ultimate impotence. "You can fry my body, but you cannot touch my soul. You can kill me, but you cannot defeat me." And this inversion, victim ridiculing executioners, broke the narrative of power that Rome was trying to establish. Executioners seemed cruel and weak. The executed seemed strong and free. Lawrence won the public relations battle posthumously. To this day, almost 2,000 years later, his name is remembered with veneration. The names of those who killed him are forgotten or cursed. Sixtus II, Sixtus II in Latin, Bishop of Rome, was a prime target in Valerian's persecution of ecclesiastical leadership. On August 6, 258 AD, just 1 year after assuming the bishopric, he was celebrating a secret liturgy in the catacombs of St. Calixtus, probably the anniversary of the martyrdom of some earlier saint. Soldiers stormed in, arresting him along with 4 deacons. Valerian had ordered the summary execution of captured clergy, without lengthy trials, without opportunity for retraction. So Sixtus and the deacons were beheaded right there in the catacombs. Blood was spilled on the tombs of previous martyrs. It was brutal efficiency. Rome had learned that public trials gave Christians a platform to preach, so they eliminated due process, making everything quick and discreet. But even a swift death did not prevent impact. Cyprian of Carthage wrote a moving letter about Sixtus's martyrdom, calling it a glorious departure and a perfect crown. Sixtus led the Roman Church for only 1 year, but that year, under intense persecution and ending in martyrdom, qualified him for perpetual veneration. Sometimes it's not the length of the ministry that matters, but how you end it. Sixtus ended well. Cecilia is a figure shrouded in legend as much as history, but the core of the testimony seems reliable. She was a young Roman noblewoman, a secret Christian, who was forced by her family to marry a pagan named Valerian. On her wedding night, she revealed to him that she was a Christian, consecrated to Christ, and that an angel guarded her virginity. Valerian, instead of being furious, was intrigued. He asked to see the angel. Cecilia said that first he needed to be baptized. He was converted, and then, according to tradition, saw the angel. Valerian even converted his brother. But the authorities discovered this, arrested both men and executed them. Cecilia buried the bodies and was imprisoned for it. The sentence: asphyxiation by steam in a hot bath, caldarium. They locked her in a bathroom heated to the maximum, expecting her to suffocate from the steam within a few hours. She survived day and night. Frustrated, they ordered an executioner to behead her. He delivered 3 blows, the maximum allowed by Roman law, but could not completely sever her head. She lay agonizing for 3 days, during which she converted hundreds who came to see her and distributed goods to the poor. Finally, she died, and the house was transformed into a church, still existing in Rome, Santa Cecilia in Trastevere. Cecilia became the patron saint of music, not because she was a musician, but because of a detail in her hagiography. During a forced marriage, while musicians played, she sang in her heart to the Lord. This image of silent worship amidst pagan celebration captured the Christian imagination. She represented the true worshipper, who praises regardless of external circumstances. Unwanted marriage, sing to God. Torture in a hot bath, sing to God. A botched decapitation, agonizing, sing to God. Praise not as a response to blessings, but as a fundamental posture of the soul independent of the situation. And this resonated especially with Christian musicians throughout the centuries, composers, singers, instrumentalists who saw in Cecilia a model of consecrated art. Music not as entertainment, but as worship, not as performance, but as prayer. Haydn, Handel, Bach dedicated works to her. Christian musical societies adopted her name, because she taught that even when the world is a cacophony of violence and injustice, Christians can and should sing a counterpoint of hope, a harmony of grace, a melody of unwavering faith. Her silent music during martyrdom was the most beautiful symphony ever composed. Clement of Rome is a mysterious figure, the fourth bishop of Rome after Peter, Linus, and Anacletus. He wrote an important letter to the Corinthians around 96 AD that demonstrates the authority of the Roman Church even at that time. Tradition says he was martyred, but details are hazy and probably embellished. The most common story: Clement was exiled to forced labor in the mines of Chersonesus, Crimea, under Trajan. There he found 2,000 Christians, also condemned, suffering extreme thirst because the water source was far away. Clement prayed, and a miracle produced a spring on the spot, a common trope in hagiography. Mass conversions occurred. Alarmed, the authorities ordered a special execution. They tied Clement to an anchor and threw him into the Black Sea. His body was supposedly deposited by angels in an underwater sanctuary that appeared once a year when the tides went out. Cyril and Methodius, missionaries to the Slavs in the 9th century, claimed to have found relics of Clement during a mission to Crimea, taking them to Rome. This history is impossible to verify, likely legendary in its details. But the symbolism is rich. The anchor, a Christian symbol of hope, becomes an instrument of death, and even dead at sea, Clement anchors the faith of Slavic communities who would venerate his relics centuries later. Rome produced more martyrs than any other city, not because Roman Christians were braver, but because Rome was the empire's capital and main stage. Every emperor who wanted to demonstrate power, every prefect who needed a scapegoat, every general who returned from campaign and offered games to the crowd, all used Christians. For 3 centuries, Christian blood continuously watered Roman soil. The Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, the Circus of Nero, countless smaller amphitheaters, all saw regular Christian executions. It is estimated, though numbers are impossible to verify, that tens of thousands died in the city of Rome and its immediate surroundings alone. And each death was a testimony, each execution an unwitting sermon, each martyr a seed planted. When Constantine finally legalized Christianity in 313 AD, Rome, the city that had killed more Christians than any other, became a Christian city. Basilicas were built over sites of martyrdom. Catacombs became pilgrimage sanctuaries. Martyrs' names were given to churches, streets, and neighborhoods. Rome was conquered not by an invading Christian army, but by martyrs dying patiently, persistently, powerfully. The empire that crucified Peter eventually bowed before the God of Peter. This is not a historical reversal. It is divine providence working through centuries of bloodshed until flowers bloom from waterlogged soil. Antioch of Syria, not to be confused with the various other Antiochs scattered throughout the empire, was the 3rd largest city in the Roman world, behind only Rome and Alexandria. Strategically located where trade routes between the Mediterranean and Asia intersected, it was a cosmopolitan, wealthy, and culturally diverse metropolis. And it had something unique. It was in Antioch that followers of Jesus were first called Christians, Acts 11:26, not as a self-designation, but as a nickname, probably mocking, given by pagans. Christianoi, little Christs, imitators of Christ. What began as an insult became a proud identity. Antioch was Paul's missionary base, the city where Peter and Paul had a famous confrontation over Jewish law and the cradle of a robust Gentile church. But this prominence came at a high price. Antioch was geographically close to centers of imperial power, so persecutions arrived early and hit hard. The community there developed a special resilience, not because they were superhuman, but because they understood early on that being Christian meant carrying a literal cross, not just a metaphorical one. Antioch produced generations of martyrs, of whom Ignatius would be the most famous, the theological spokesperson for them all. Ignatius of Antioch. We've already spoken extensively about him, but in the context of the Near East it's worth emphasizing. He was Eastern, not Western. Syrian, he probably spoke Greek with an accent and thought with Eastern cultural categories, and this shaped his theology. The East had traditions of more extreme asceticism, a more mystical spirituality, and a valuing of suffering as a path to purification. When Ignatius wrote about wishing to be ground by the teeth of wild beasts, it wasn't just a dramatic metaphor. It genuinely reflected an Eastern worldview where physical suffering could be a gateway to spiritual union with the divine. His letters circulated first among Eastern churches, Ephesus, Magnesia, Tralles, Philadelphia, Smyrna, before reaching the West, establishing a pattern of martyrial theology that the Syrian church would follow for centuries. When he was captured and sent to Rome, a journey of weeks across territory that is now Turkey, Greece, and Italy, he was literally exporting Eastern theology of martyrdom to the heart of the Western Empire. And it worked. Rome executed his body, but his ideas won Rome back. The Syrian who died in a Roman arena would eventually shape how the Roman Church would think about suffering for Christ. A wonderful historical irony. Simeon, or Simon of Jerusalem, was a cousin of Jesus according to tradition preserved by Eusebius, son of Clopas, brother of Joseph. He assumed leadership of the church in Jerusalem after James, the Lord's brother, was martyred in 62 AD. It was a logical choice. Maintaining leadership within Jesus' family preserved continuity and legitimacy. Simeon shepherded through a catastrophic period. The destruction of Jerusalem by Rome in 70 AD, the Jewish diaspora, and growing tensions between Jews and Jewish Christians. But he survived for decades, keeping the community functioning under impossible circumstances. Finally, under Trajan around 107 AD, the same period as Ignatius, Simeon was denounced by both Jews and Christian heretics. He was over 100 years old, if the chronology is correct. He was tortured for days, authorities apparently impressed that such an old man could endure so much. Finally, he was crucified, dying in the same way as his cousin Jesus, almost 80 years earlier. The symmetry is both poetic and theological. Jesus' family, literally blood relatives, shed their blood for him. Simeon closed the circle. He witnessed Jesus' ministry as a young man, then pastored his church for decades and died on the cross like him. He was the ultimate witness. I knew Jesus personally, and I choose to die for him. Jerusalem after 70 AD was never the same again. When Roman legions under Titus besieged the city during a Jewish revolt, the siege lasted for horrific months. Famine, cannibalism, death everywhere. When the walls finally fell, the Romans entered furious at having lost so many soldiers and systematically destroyed everything. The temple was burned, according to Josephus, against Titus's orders, but soldiers did it anyway. Molten gold from the temple flowed between the stones, and soldiers dismantled stone by stone, searching for gold, literally fulfilling Jesus' prophecy. Not one stone will be left upon another. Jerusalem was devastated, its population killed or enslaved. But the Christians of Jerusalem, they had fled before. Jesus had given a sign. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near, flee, Luke 21. And they fled to Pella, a city beyond the Jordan. They were accused of cowardice by non-Christian Jews of betraying their nation. But Christians understood they were no longer an ethnic nation. They were a spiritual people. The physical temple would be destroyed because the true temple was Christ. So they went out, they survived, while Jerusalem burned. Sometimes faithfulness seems like cowardice. Sometimes wisdom seems like betrayal. Discerning the difference is a gift of the Spirit. But the flight to Pella also created theological and identity problems. Jerusalemite Christians were, until 70 AD, predominantly ethnic Jews who saw Christianity as a fulfillment of Judaism, not a separate religion. They frequented the temple, observed dietary laws, and circumcised their sons. But after 70 AD, without the temple, geographically separated from Jerusalem, the distinction between Judaism and Christianity became clearer and more unavoidable. The Pella community eventually became a marginal group, neither fully accepted by Jews, who saw them as traitors, nor fully integrated into Gentile Christianity, which saw them as legalists. They produced fewer martyrs not for lack of faith, but because they were demographically small and geographically isolated. The lesson: not every Christian community has the same trajectory. Some are called to dramatic martyrdom in imperial capitals, others to faithful survival in obscure exile. Both are legitimate. The Church of Jerusalem de Pella did not have Ignatius or Polycarp, but it preserved memories about Jesus that eventually influenced the Gospels. Their contribution was literary and testimonial, not martyrdom. And that was enough. God doesn't have a single template for faithfulness. Edessa, a city in Mesopotamia, present-day Şanlıurfa in Turkey, was on the eastern border of the Roman Empire, a gateway to the Persian world. It held an extraordinary distinction. It was probably the first officially Christian city in history. Tradition, possibly legendary but interesting, says that King Abgar V of Edessa corresponded with Jesus, asking for healing, and Jesus replied, promising that after his ascension, a disciple would come. Thaddeus, or Addai, is said to have gone, converting the king and the city. Historically dubious, but the core truth seems to be that Christianity arrived in Edessa very early, perhaps as early as 40–50 AD, and grew rapidly. Edessa spoke Syriac, an Aramaic dialect, not Greek, so it developed a Christianity linguistically and culturally distinct from Greco-Roman Christianity. Here was born a Syriac tradition that would produce theologians like Ephraim, mystical poets, and extreme ascetics. But also martyrs, especially when Edessa came under Roman control during imperial persecutions, or when it fell under Persian rule that persecuted Christians for loyalty to Rome. Edessa was always caught between two fires, a suspicious double loyalty. Christians there learned to navigate persecution, coming from multiple directions, developing flexibility and resilience. They were pioneers of Eastern Christianity that would reach China via the Silk Road centuries later. Regarding Thomas, an important correction is necessary. He was not martyred in the Near East, but in India, according to a strong tradition preserved by the Syro-Malabar Church of Kerala. We mention him here only to clarify the geography. Thomas represents missionary expansion beyond Roman borders. He left the empire entirely, taking the gospel to the Indian subcontinent, where he established communities that have existed uninterruptedly for 2,000 years. His martyrdom by spear in Milapur, Chennai, occurred outside Roman jurisdiction, proving that persecution was not an exclusively Roman phenomenon. Wherever the gospel went, it encountered resistance, whether from emperors, Brahmins, pagan priests, any power structure threatened by Christ's message. Thomas is a reminder. Martyrs were not only victims of Rome, they were victims of universal darkness that manifested itself through various political and religious systems. The battle is cosmic, not just political, and it reached India as certainly as it reached Rome. Martyrdom proved the universality of both the gospel and the opposition to it. Near Eastern communities faced multiple layers of persecution that Westerners sometimes did not experience. First, Roman imperial persecution, edicts, searches, executions. Second, persecution by local authorities, provincial governors, client kings of Rome, who had significant autonomy. Third, communal persecution, religious mobs of other traditions, Judaism, local paganism, Zoroastrianism on the Persian borders, attacking Christians without official sanction, spontaneous lynchings. Fourth, familial persecution, in Eastern cultures where family honor was paramount. Conversion often meant being disinherited, expelled, sometimes killed by one's own relatives. The East was a multi-layered minefield where Christians navigated daily. Survival required not only courage, but profound strategic wisdom. And when they died, whether by formal Roman execution or lynching in a remote village, the distinction mattered less than the central fact. They died for Jesus. The East taught that martyrdom has 1,000 faces, but one essence, and it prepared the Church for future expansion into non-Western contexts, where these layers of persecution would be the norm, not the exception. The Syriac Church, centered in Antioch and Edessa, developed a theological corpus on martyrdom heavily influenced by Ignatius, but expanded by later generations. Syriac hymns celebrated martyrs as brides of Christ, especially virgin martyrs, spiritual athletes competing in a cosmic arena, treasures of the Church more precious than gold. They developed liturgical calendars centered on martyr commemorations, transforming the ecclesiastical year into a continuous narrative of bloody witness. And Syriac theology placed particular emphasis on the physical body as the site of spiritual battle and victory. The tortured body of the martyr was the field where Christ defeated Satan again. It wasn't Platonic dualism despising the flesh. It was a radical affirmation that God redeems matter, and the crucified body of the martyr participated bodily in the crucifixion of Christ. When you read Syriac poetry about martyrs, it's visceral, sensory, almost erotic in intensity, because they took theological incarnation seriously. If God became flesh in Christ, then the tortured flesh of the martyr was a sacrament, a tangible revelation of divine love. The West would learn much of this through translations, but the East experienced it first. During Diocletian's great persecution, the Near East suffered especially because it was a militarized border region. Diocletian resided in Nicomedia, Asia Minor, geographically close, so edicts were rigorously enforced. Furthermore, co-emperor Galerius, an anti-Christian fanatic who likely instigated the persecution, directly controlled eastern provinces. He viewed Christians as a potential fifth column on the Persian frontier, where loyalty was a matter of national security. Refusal to sacrifice to the emperor seemed like military treason. Therefore, persecution in the East had a national security dimension that the West did not feel as intensely. Entire cities were devastated. In Phrygia, soldiers burned an entire city where the population was predominantly Christian, burning everyone alive. In Antioch, executions were daily for months. Edessa lost bishops, clergy, and countless lay people. But Eastern communities had such a deeply rooted tradition of martyrdom that, ironically, they were more psychologically prepared than Westerners. Not that they suffered less, but they had internalized a theology that transformed suffering into worship. And when the storm finally passed, Eastern churches emerged wounded but intact, ready for the next phase, the Christological debates of the 4th century that would also center on the East. Now we're switching from geography to psychology. What was happening within what gave courage to martyrs? First, a crucial concept: baptism of blood. The early church taught that there were 3 baptisms: water, normal; spirit, Pentecost, conversion; and blood, martyrdom. If someone was a catechumen, preparing for baptism, but died confessing Christ before being baptized in water, the shed blood counted as complete baptism. This was not abstract theory. It had urgent practical application. During persecutions, catechumens were sometimes imprisoned before completing baptismal preparation. They faced a dilemma: apostatize, saving life but losing salvation, or confess Christ, dying without formal baptism. The theology of baptism of blood resolved this anguish. Their death, your baptism. The blood of Christ applied through your own blood. This gave tremendous courage. You wouldn't die unbaptized, technically outside the church. You would be baptized in the act of dying, united to Christ in death, just as normal baptism unites you to Christ in death and resurrection. It was sacramental, not merely symbolic, and this conviction transformed the terror of premature death into the expectation of definitive baptism. But an even deeper foundation was the theology of participation in the sufferings of Christ. Paul wrote, "I want to know Christ, and the participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death." Philippians 3:10. Peter, "Rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings." 1 Peter 4:13. It wasn't masochism, it was mystical union. When a martyr was tortured, he did not suffer alone. Christ suffered, in it and with him. When he was crucified, he relived Christ's crucifixion, not as a repetition, but as a participation. It was like a marriage where two become one flesh. Martyr and Christ were so united that the suffering of one was the suffering of the other. And this had a powerful implication. If you participate in the sufferings of Christ, you will also participate in his glory. Present suffering was a guarantee of future glory. It was not a bargain. I suffer X, I gain Y. It was the logic of union, united to him in death, certainly united to him in resurrection. Martyrs were not stoic heroes enduring pain alone. They were brides united to the bridegroom, experiencing a mystery of love that goes beyond death. And this love was stronger than pain, more real than torture, more concrete than death. And the hope of bodily resurrection was absolutely central. Many ancient philosophies offered immortality of the soul: Platonism, Stoicism, mystery religions. But Christianity promised something unique: resurrection of the physical body. The same tortured, burned, torn body would be reconstituted, glorified, immortalized. This explains why Christians venerated relics of martyrs so intensely. They were not merely sentimental mementos, they were seeds of a future body. Those bones would be resurrected. That blood would be reintegrated. A body that the arena shattered, God would rebuild better than new. And this concrete hope gave concrete physical courage. Pagan philosophers could speak of an immortal soul escaping the prison of the body. Then death was liberation. But for Christians, the body mattered eternally. You were not losing your body. You were planting it as a seed that would sprout immortal. Paul: it is sown perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. 1 Corinthians 15. Martyrs were spiritual farmers, planting mortal flesh in the earth, trusting in a harvest of immortal flesh. And this concrete confidence in a physical future made the physical present bearable. Pain is temporary. A glorified body is eternal. But we need to understand, refusal to sacrifice was not political stubbornness or social rebellion. It was a matter of profound theological conscience. Christians were not anarchists. They paid taxes, obeyed civil laws, and prayed for authorities. Paul, in Romans 13, teaches submission to government. So why not sacrifice? Because idolatry was cosmic betrayal, not just civil disobedience. When Romans sacrificed to gods, they believed they were participating in a network of divine human relationships that maintained cosmic order. To refuse was not only to insult the emperor, but to threaten the structure of reality in the pagan mind. And Christians agreed that it was a cosmic act, but inversely. To sacrifice would be to recognize God's demons as real and legitimate. It would be to participate in disguised satanic worship. It was spiritual adultery, infidelity to Christ, who was the bridegroom. It wasn't about politics. It was about ultimate loyalty. And this conviction transcended political calculations. You can negotiate politics. You cannot negotiate worship. So Christians died not as political revolutionaries, but as faithful worshippers who refused to prostitute themselves spiritually. It was a matter of absolute theological integrity. Better to die pure than to live contaminated. Christians viewed death not as an end, but as a transition, a tunnel between rooms, not a fall into an abyss. Pagan philosophies offered versions of life after death, but they were nebulous, uncertain, sometimes depressing, the dark underworld of Hades. Christianity offered concrete certainty, to depart and be with Christ, which was far better, Philippians 1:23. Not maybe, not we hope, but certainty. Christ resurrected, appeared to hundreds, ascended to heaven. He paved the way. Death was simply following a path he had already trod and made safe. It was like a child jumping from a height into a father's arms, frightening to jump, but safe because the father is down there ensuring it. Martyrs jumped from life to death, trusting that Christ's arms would catch them on the other side. And accounts of martyrs often included visions at the moment of death, Jesus standing, receiving, as Stephen saw, angels descending, heaven opening. Were these visions hallucinations caused by trauma? or were they thin veils between dimensions tearing apart, allowing glimpses of a more real reality? Martyrs believed the latter. And this certainty of celestial reception transformed the execution of tragedy into a graduation, an end into a beginning. And Christian communities celebrated the death anniversaries of martyrs, birthday. They didn't mourn as tragedies, but celebrated as feasts. Because death was birth into true life. You don't cry on birthdays, you celebrate. So churches marked calendars, gathered at tombs, celebrated the Eucharist over relics, told stories, sang hymns. It was an active communal memory that transformed trauma into liturgy, loss into gain, absence into mystical presence. The martyr was more present after death than before, because now he was with Christ and could intercede from a privileged position. This practice began spontaneously in the 2nd century. We see it in the martyrdom of Polycarp, and developed into an elaborate liturgical system during the 4th, 5th centuries. Eventually, it would become a Catholic Orthodox saints calendar with thousands of commemorated saints. But it began simply. The community gathering on the day a brother or sister died, remembering, celebrating, asking for intercession, renewing commitment. It was a form of mourning that did not deny pain but transcended it through eschatological hope. Death did not have the last word. Christ did. And the community proclaimed this annually. The veneration of martyrs developed an additional dimension. They were seen as advocates, or especially powerful intercessors before God. The logic was, martyrs paid the ultimate price, proved supreme loyalty, and are certainly in the presence of God. Therefore, their prayers carry special weight. When you asked for a martyr's prayer, visiting a tomb invoking their name, it was like having a defense attorney with impeccable credentials. Christ was the unique mediator between God and humans. This doctrine was never questioned. But the intercession of saints, especially martyrs, was seen as analogous to asking for the prayer of a living friend. You don't replace Christ. You ask that Christ's closest brother carry your petition. Obviously, this would develop into problematic practices in the Middle Ages, excesses that the Reformation would correct. But the core was simple trust in the communion of saints, that death does not break the body of Christ, that we can ask for prayers from members who have already passed on to glory. It was beautiful when balanced, recognizing that the Church is an extended family through life and death, with older members, martyrs, helping younger ones, us, until we reach where they are. Theology consistently affirmed that a martyr's death was not defeat, but victory. This seemed contrary to the evidence. A shattered body, screaming in pain, silenced forever. How could that be victory? But the Christian perspective reversed this. The arena was a spiritual battlefield. On one side, Rome with military political power. On the other, the unarmed martyr. But who truly held power? Rome could kill the body, but it could not make the martyr deny Christ. Therefore, the martyr had greater power, power over their own soul. Rome could silence the voice, but the eloquent death of the martyr preached louder than words. Therefore, the martyr won the battle of persuasion. Rome wanted to intimidate other Christians, but martyrdom encouraged them. Therefore, the Roman strategy failed. And above all, the martyr went to eternal glory, while the emperor went to judgment. In the final cosmic balance, who won? The shattered one who is with Christ, or the powerful one who is separated from him? Victory was redefined in terms of eternity, not temporality. From this perspective, every martyr who died confessing Christ was an absolute victor. They did not lose their lives, they invested them and will receive an infinite return. But a crucial distinction. Early Christians absolutely rejected suicide, even while embracing martyrdom. What's the difference? Suicide is taking control of the life God gave you, ending it out of despair or escapism. Martyrdom is surrendering your life into God's hands when authorities demand apostasy. Not seeking death, but accepting it as a consequence of faithfulness. The distinction seemed subtle but was crucial. Christians did not seek to be arrested. They did not voluntarily offer themselves for execution, although some rigorists did so and were criticized by the church mainstream. The church taught prudence, fleeing when possible. Jesus said, "When they persecute you in one city, flee to another." Denying under extreme coercion was not unforgivable. Peter denied 3 times and was restored. Using legal subterfuge was legitimate. Paul appealed to Roman citizenship. But if captured, judged, and forced to choose between Christ or life, choosing Christ was not suicide. It was witness. The line was, "Do not seek death, but do not avoid it with apostasy." Living faithfully was the objective. To die faithfully was acceptable. Suicide was condemnable. Martyrdom was glorious. And this distinction maintained martyrdom as an extraordinary testimony, not an ordinary act of despair. Perpetua. We have already explored her story extensively, but in the context of women's narratives, it is worth emphasizing a specific dimension. She was noble. She had everything Roman society valued in a high-class woman: education, wealth, a respectable family, a son who was the heir, a secure future. Society expected her to live a comfortable life, managing the household, raising children, and aging with aristocratic dignity. But she traded it all for Christ. And this wasn't an impulsive decision of a rebellious teenager. She was 22 years old, a mother, and knew exactly what she was sacrificing. Her father begged on his knees, not a cruel tyrant, but a loving, desperate father trying to save his daughter from madness, in his view. She refused not out of hatred for her family, but out of a greater love. And this choice demolished Roman notions of appropriate femininity. A woman should be submissive, obedient, family-centered. Perpetua was all of that, and she challenged all of that when loyalties clashed. She proved that Christian women were not rebels without a cause. They were faithful to a kingdom that transcended all earthly kingdoms. True nobility did not come from birth. It came from a character formed by Christ. Perpetua's most painful sacrifice wasn't physical torture. It was leaving her baby while still breastfeeding. Her diary records visceral anguish, breasts aching from the milk, a baby crying with hunger when she visited the prison, the excruciating pain of eventually stopping breastfeeding. Drying milk meant a physical severing of the most intimate bond possible. Any mother who is breastfed understands. It's not just nutrition, it's a deep hormonal, emotional, and spiritual connection. To break that voluntarily by choosing prison over apostasy, it's a sacrifice that men literally cannot experience with the same physical depth. Perpetua knew her baby probably wouldn't remember her, would grow up without a mother, perhaps even hate her for abandoning him. But she chose Christ anyway, not because she didn't love her son. The diary proves she loved him intensely, but because she understood that loving Christ more than her son was the only way to love her son correctly. If she denied Christ to stay with her baby, she would be teaching her son that convenience trumps conviction, that family is a substitute idol for God. It's better for him to grow up an orphan with a legacy of unwavering faith than with a living but apostate mother. The pain was real. The choice was right. Felicity, Perpetua's slave, faced an additional layer of suffering that free women did not experience. Labor in prison, without adequate medical assistance, in horrific sanitary conditions. She was 8 months pregnant when she was arrested. Guards mocked her. If you scream like that now during childbirth, imagine when wild beasts get you. But her response was theology condensed into a phrase. Now it is I who suffer. There, another will suffer for me. She understood substitution. Christ would bear pain she could not bear alone. But even so, she had to go through premature labor induced by stress and prayer. The community prayed for the baby to be born before the scheduled execution. She gave birth to a girl on the filthy cell floor, immediately gave her to a Christian to adopt. She didn't even have postpartum days to recover or breastfeed. And 3 days later, she was in the arena being gored by a wild cow. Felicity experienced motherhood compressed into hours. Conception, gestation, childbirth, separation, death, all at the speed of martyrdom. And through it all, she maintained her faith. Enslaved women were considered property, wombs to produce more slaves. Happiness subverted this. Her womb produced a life that would be free, a girl adopted by a Christian family, and her death brought eternal freedom. Physical slavery became a springboard to spiritual freedom. Blandina, a young slave in Lyon, was physically frail. Even her Christian owner feared she would break under torture. But Blandina proved that spiritual strength does not correlate with physical strength. Tortured repeatedly from dawn to dusk, she only repeated, "I am a Christian and nothing bad happens between us." It was a mantra of sanity amidst madness, a declaration of identity when torturers tried to reduce her to flesh while screaming. And it had a class dimension impossible to ignore. This slave was shaming free men, trained soldiers, powerful authorities. All of them, with massive social advantages, could not break a girl without legal rights, without protection, without anything except Christ. The inversion was so complete that Christian witnesses wrote they saw Christ crucified in her. Not a metaphor, they literally saw Jesus suffering through her. Blandina became a transparent icon, so united with Christ that he shone through her. And this defied everything that Roman patriarchal society taught. Women were weak, slaves were cowards. The combination of the two was absolute social zero. But Blandina was a spiritual giant who made the Roman Empire seem like a moral dwarf. The last became first, the servant became queen. The tortured slave wore a crown that emperors would never touch. Cecilia maintained her faith through a forced marriage, a reality faced by millions of women throughout history. Parents arranged marriages for political, economic, and social reasons. The daughter's feelings were irrelevant. Cecilia was betrothed to Valerian, a pagan nobleman. The wedding night was supposed to be consummation, it was evangelization. She said, "I am consecrated to Christ, and an angel guards my purity." Valerian could have reacted with violence, his legal right as her husband. But God touched his heart through her courage. He asked to see the angel. She said, "First be baptized." He was. He converted, and the forced marriage became a missionary partnership. Both lived in consecrated chastity, a white marriage not consummated, used their wealth to help persecuted Christians, and were eventually martyred together. Cecilia transformed a potential curse, forced marriage to a pagan, into a blessing, the conversion of her entire family. And she taught something that Christian feminists today need to hear. Resistance is not always open rebellion. Sometimes it is creative fidelity that subverts the system from within. Cecilia did not run away from marriage, nor did she refuse cultural obedience. But she redefined both through Christ. She obeyed the structure while subverting its foundation, and she triumphed not through confrontation, but through persevering witness. Barbara suffered the ultimate family betrayal, martyred by her own father. Dioscorus, a fanatical pagan nobleman, locked his daughter in a tower to protect her or control her. The line is thin. But isolation gave Barbara time to question, search, and find Christ. When her father found out, he saw it as a triple betrayal: religious, abandoning gods; familial, disobeying her father; and social, shaming the family name. In a Mediterranean culture of honor, shame, this was unbearable. Dioscorus was not a sadistic monster. He was a father who saw his daughter's Christian conversion as the destruction of everything he valued. So he tortured her personally, trying to save her from his distorted perspective. When the authorities condemned her, he asked for the honor of executing her personally. He climbed a mountain and beheaded his own daughter, and tradition says that as he descended, lightning killed him. Real or symbolic, the message resonated. God sees, God judges. A toxic patriarchy that kills daughters in the name of honor is an abomination that cries out for divine justice. Barbara exposed the dark side of the Roman patriarchal family, werefather of the family. He had the power of life and death over his children. Christianity challenged this absolutist power, placing God above the earthly father. And Barbara paid the price for this subversion, but she also planted a seed that would blossom into a new understanding of family based on love, not power. Prisca was a teenager, only 13 years old according to tradition, facing both matrimonial and religious pressure. A wealthy Roman official wanted to marry her off. Her family pressured her. It was about honor, a guaranteed future, social advancement. But Prisca had consecrated her virginity to Christ, a common practice among young Christian women who saw celibacy as a form of autonomy and exclusive devotion. She refused marriage. Her rejected suitor, publicly humiliated, denounced her as a Christian. It was the ancient equivalent of revenge porn. If I can't have her, I'll destroy her. Prisca was arrested, tortured, and executed at 13. 13, an age when today's teenagers are preoccupied with fashion, friends, and social media. Prisca was choosing decapitation over a secure marriage. How? Because she understood that marriage to a pagan would mean either apostatizing, living in constant conflict, or converting an uncertain husband. She saw clearly it is better to die pure than to live compromised. And this moral clarity at such a young age exposes something. Genuine faith does not require decades of maturity. Young people can have convictions as profound as those of the elderly, sometimes purer because they are not tainted by cynicism and accumulated compromises. Prisca shames adults who trade faith for convenience. If a child can die for Christ, what excuse do you have for not dying to live radically for Him? Catherine of Alexandria was an intellectualized Perpetua, noble, educated, a philosopher at 18. When the emperor, Diocletian or Maxentius, sources vary, ordered a festival with sacrifices, she publicly confronted him with philosophical arguments. Not with violence, not with political rebellion, but with reason. She challenged him to a debate between pagan philosophy and Christian theology. He summoned 50 of the empire's best philosophers to humiliate her. Total backfire. She defeated them argumentatively, and several converted right there. The emperor, enraged by the public humiliation, offered her marriage, making her empress, if she renounced Christ. She refused. "I am the bride of Christ." Then they tried to break her body, since they couldn't break her mind. Our torture wheel with blades, hence Catherine's wheel. Tradition says the wheel miraculously broke. Finally, decapitation. Catherine proved that Christianity was not a religion of the ignorant, as pagan critics claimed. It could compete and win in the marketplace of ideas. An educated Christian woman was a formidable intellectual force. And she became the patron saint of philosophers, students, and universities, not despite being a woman, but through of being a brilliant woman who refused to use her intelligence to advance a worldly career, using it instead to defend truth, even at the cost of her life. Potamiana, a Christian slave in Alexandria, refused her master's sexual advances. When pressure turned into a threat, she maintained her purity. Her enraged master denounced her as a Christian. If he couldn't possess her living body, he would destroy it. The chosen execution method was particularly horrific, a cauldron of boiling pitch, a slow plunge starting from her feet. 3 hours of agony. The soldier Basilides, in charge of the execution, was kind to her along the way, a small act of mercy amidst the brutality. Potamiana prayed for him, spoke of Christ. He watched her die singing as her skin melted. And that broke something within him. Days later, he declared himself a Christian and was also executed. Potamiana possessed a power her master would never have. The power to maintain dignity when everything was taken away. The power to love her enemy while he tortured her. The power to evangelize on her way to death. A slave without human rights possessed a spiritual authority that free men did not. And her story teaches a harsh truth for today. How many women face harassment, threats, sexual violence, and blackmail for refusing to compromise their purity? How many lose their jobs, are slandered, socially destroyed for not giving in? Potamiana says, "It's worth it. Purity preserved with blood is a treasure that no one can steal," and her testimony converted her own tormentor. Perfect revenge, not out of hatred, but out of love. Looking collectively at these women martyrs, a pattern emerges. All defied the gender expectations of patriarchal Roman society. Perpetua challenged absolute paternal authority. Felicity redefined enslaved motherhood. Blandina subverted female weakness. Cecilia transformed forced marriage. Barbara resisted extreme paternal control. Prisca rejected marriage as an inevitable destiny. Catherine proved female philosophical competence. Potamiana maintained bodily autonomy under coercion. In each case, Roman society said a woman should be X, submissive, silent, obedient to her father, husband, home-centered, sexually available if enslaved, intellectually inferior. And each martyr responded, "I am a Christian first, a woman second. My primary identity is not gender or class, it is Christ." This was revolutionary because it radically dignified women. In the Colosseum, a noblewoman died with the same courage as a free man, a slave with the same dignity as a senator. Their blood had identical value. Their courage was equivalent. And this planted seeds of equality that, although they took centuries to fully blossom, were there from the beginning. In Christ, there is neither male nor female. Martyrdom proved the theology Paul taught. Now we shift to a different but equally complex narrative: martyred soldiers. We begin with Basilides, whose dramatic arc we have already touched upon, from executioner to convert to martyr. But it deserves elaboration because it represents a pattern that Rome didn't know how to combat. The more soldiers executed Christians, the more soldiers converted. It was a devastating operational paradox. The army depended on obedient soldiers, brutal when necessary, unquestioning. But when a soldier witnessed a Christian like Potamiana die with love and forgiveness, when he saw an elderly man being tortured while singing hymns, when he witnessed a child refusing to deny Jesus until his last breath, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Basilides was trained to see enemies as subhuman, facilitating violence. But Potamiana treated him as human, as the image of God, as a precious soul worthy of salvation. And this humanization disarmed hatred, penetrated psychological armor. Basilides realized, I am on the wrong side. The criminals I execute are saints. The heroes I command are tyrants. So he switched sides, knowing it would cost him his life. And he died not as an executioner, but as a witness. His conversion was a greater threat to Rome than 1,000 armed rebellions, because it exposed that the empire was morally bankrupt. When the executioners themselves turn against the system is doomed. Sebastian, captain of the Praetorian Guard, was even more strategic. He was a secretly infiltrated Christian, using his position of power to help the church clandestinely. But when persecution intensified under Diocletian, he realized he could no longer live a double life. The decisive moment came when he was forced to choose: sacrifice to the gods or declare his faith. Before his fellow soldiers and perhaps the emperor, Sebastian revealed himself. It was devastating betrayal for the military establishment, a captain of the elite. Diocletian ordered a cruel maximum execution. Tied to a post, his fellow soldiers would use him as a target for archery. Arrows covered him until he looked like a porcupine. They left him to die. But Sebastian miraculously survived, was healed by a Christian widow, and weeks later, still wounded, scarred all over his body, did something unbelievable. He returned. He positioned himself where the emperor would pass and preached publicly, denouncing injustices. This time they killed him with clubs, threw his body into the sewer. But Sebastian proved something crucial. Some people need a second chance to complete their testimony. He had been a secret Christian, perhaps feeling guilty for not confessing sooner. God gave him a second chance. Sebastian didn't waste it, and he became the patron saint of soldiers, athletes, all who face literal or metaphorical arrows, because he exemplified courage under direct fire. Maurice and the Theban Legion represent a collective military martyrdom that, if historical, was the largest single massacre of Christians for military refusal. Tradition says the Theban Legion was an Egyptian military unit composed entirely of Coptic Christians, 6,600 soldiers under the command of Maurice. Emperor Maximian ordered them to participate in the persecution of local Christians and sacrifice to the gods to guarantee military victory. The entire legion refused. Maximian ordered decimation, executing every 10th soldier. The legion maintained its refusal, a second decimation. They still refused. Finally, Maximian ordered the massacre of the entire legion. 6,600 Christian soldiers executed by fellow soldiers. The numbers seem exaggerated. A typical Roman legion had about 5,000, and 6,600 is suspiciously round. History probably mixes fact with legend. Perhaps a historical core of a smaller group, amplified through the centuries. But the symbolism remains powerful. Christian soldiers choosing to die rather than persecute brothers in faith, loyalty to Christ overcoming military loyalty, an entire unit preferring extinction to apostasy. Real or legendary in the details, the concept resonates. There is a point where following orders becomes complicity with evil, and a Christian soldier must say no, even at the cost of everything. Nuremberg, decades before Nuremberg. Christian soldiers faced a structural dilemma that civilians did not experience with the same intensity. Institutionalized loyalty. Civilians could, in theory, live relatively anonymously, avoiding direct confrontation with authorities. But soldiers, they formally swore allegiance to the emperor, participated in military rituals that included sacrifices to the gods, asking for victory, and saw the emperor as a divine commander legitimized by the gods. All of this was embedded in military culture. So becoming a Christian created an immediate systemic conflict. You could try to compartmentalize, I'm a soldier at work, a Christian at home, but eventually realities would collide. Orders would come to persecute Christians, or participate in collective sacrifice or affirm the emperor's divinity. And then what? Some Christian soldiers tried to navigate, obeying orders that weren't directly idolatrous, deserting when orders crossed a red line, seeking transfers to less problematic posts. Others, like Sebastian and Maurice, eventually confronted the system openly. There was no easy solution, and this generated a theological debate that the church never completely resolved. Can Christians serve militarily? Tertullian said no, sword and cross are incompatible. Others said yes if you don't participate in idolatry. Tension remains today, and many Christian soldiers made a more problematic choice. They feigned apostasy to survive. During persecutions, when entire units were forced to sacrifice, some would quickly throw incense, murmur words without meaning them, buy fake certificates, basically passing as pagans while maintaining faith internally. Then when the persecution ended, they would come to the church confessing, asking for forgiveness, tormented by guilt. The church called these child military personnel, and the debate continued. Should they be readmitted? Rigorists said no. Apostasy is apostasy, feigned or real. Merciful ones said yes with penance. Peter denied 3 times and was restored. But there was an additional complication with soldiers. They not only saved their own lives, they potentially participated in persecuting other Christians while maintaining a pagan facade. This was different from a civilian who sacrificed under torture. It was a more complex betrayal. Some bishops refused to readmit soldiers. Child, unless they abandoned their military careers entirely. They couldn't serve 2 masters. Others were more pastorally sensitive, recognizing the unique structural pressures soldiers faced. The debate exposed real tension. How to live faithfully within fundamentally compromised institutions. A relevant question today for Christians in corrupt governments, unethical corporations, and unjust systems. Do you stay and try to reform, or leave and keep your hands clean? There is no simple answer. But soldiers who chose martyrdom instead of compromise became heroes of resistance. Not military resistance, they didn't take up arms against Rome, but moral, spiritual resistance. George, Sebastian, Maurice, and others proved that you could be a loyal soldier, trained, courageous, disciplined, and faithful Christians refusing unjust orders. They were not cowardly deserters, they were courageous, conscientious objectors. The distinction matters because Rome tried to portray Christians as cowards who avoided military service out of weakness. Military martyrs shattered this narrative. You call us weak? We are elite soldiers who chose to die rather than deny Christ. Who is weak? We who die for conviction, or you who kill out of fear? And this inversion was powerfully apologetic. Military recruiters even began to value Christian soldiers when they weren't persecuting them, because they were known for discipline, honesty, fierce loyalty, provided that loyalty didn't require idolatry. Ironically, the qualities that made Christian soldiers excellent militarily were the same ones that would eventually put them in fatal conflict with the empire. You want soldiers of firm principles? But what if their principles override your commands? Rome never resolved this paradox. Eventually, under Constantine, it resolved it through conversion. If the empire becomes Christian, the paradox disappears. But until then, martyred soldiers lived through agonizing tension daily. And here emerges a greater theological tension: Christian militarism versus Christian pacifism. The early church was largely pacifist: Tertullian, Origen, Hippolytus, All argued that Christians should not serve militarily because the army inevitably involved violence and idolatry. How can a soldier of Christ wield a sword? But the reality was more nuanced. There were Christians in the army since the 1st century, Centurion Cornelius in Acts 10, soldiers who asked John the Baptist, "What should we do?" They were not commanded to desert but to be righteous. And as the empire became Christianized, the question became, if fall, who will defend the borders if desertion occurs? Who will protect the innocent from barbarian invaders? Absolute pacifism worked when Christians were a marginal minority. But what happened when they became the majority responsible for civilization? Tension forced a reassessment. Augustine would develop the theory of just war. Violence can be moral if it is defensive, proportional, a last resort, authorized by legitimate authority, and aimed at peace. It was a pragmatic compromise that allowed Christian military participation, but with moral limits. Military martyrs contributed to the debate by showing that Christian soldiers could serve to the extent where service demanded sin. They weren't absolute pacifists. They were in the army after all. But they had a non-negotiable red line. This opened up theological space for the Christian tradition of military service with selective, conscientious objection. But we need to be honest. Martyred soldiers also complicate the pacifist narrative that many like to project onto early Christianity. Christians were all pacifists until Constantine corrupted the church. This statement is far too simplistic. If soldiers like Sebastian, Maurice, and dozens of others mentioned in martyrologies were active Christians while serving militarily, then obviously the early church was not uniformly pacifist. There was diversity of perspective. Some bishops refused to baptize soldiers, others baptized but demanded that they not kill. Still others baptized active soldiers without demanding desertion. There was no universal consensus. And martyred soldiers existed on a spectrum. Some were pacifists who served in a non-combatant capacity, administration, logistics, until they were forced to choose between idolatry or death. Others were active combatants who fought in battles but refused to specifically persecute Christians. So martyred soldier does not necessarily mean pacifist. It means a Christian who prioritized Christ over military orders when conflict was irreconcilable. And this is a universal lesson applicable to any profession. You can be a police officer, judge, politician, businessman, teacher, any role with institutional authority. But there is always a point where the system demands something that a Christian conscience cannot provide. Martyred soldiers modeled how to identify and resist at that point, even at the cost of career, freedom, and life. And finally, martyred soldiers preserve an important memory for the church. Military courage can be sanctified. Christian culture sometimes romanticizes meekness to the point of despising strong masculinity, physical courage, and a willingness to fight. But George slaying a dragon, a later legend, Sebastian facing arrows, Maurice leading a legion, these images captured the Christian imagination because they respond to a deep longing. Men want to be warriors for something greater than themselves. The problem is not the warrior impulse, it is misdirecting it. Martyred soldiers showed redirect military courage to spiritual battle. Be a warrior, but for Christ, not for Caesar. Fight, but against principalities and powers, not flesh and blood. Die if necessary, but die witnessing to truth, not imposing it by force. It is robust but redeemed Christian masculinity, strong but servant, courageous but compassionate, willing to die but reluctant to kill. And this resonates even today with Christian men seeking a model of masculinity that is neither toxic machismo nor neutral passivity. Martyred soldiers say, you can be a man of fierce courage and tender faith simultaneously. These are characteristics of Christ, the Lion and the Lamb. They forged them with their blood. And that model still inspires men and women today to be warriors of the kingdom, not with swords of metal, but with truth that cuts deeper than any steel. The most devastating sight in any persecution is children dying, and it happened constantly. When Roman authorities arrested entire Christian families, they made no distinction of age. If parents refused to sacrifice, they executed everyone: father, mother, teenage children, toddlers, even babies. Not out of random cruelty, although it was cruel, but out of a logic of systematic extermination. Christianity was seen as a family infection transmitted from generation to generation. If you killed only the parents but spared the children would grow up hating Rome and perpetuating the faith. So they eliminated entire families. Accounts of martyrdom mention almost casually, and their children too, as if it were a minor detail. But each and their children too represents indescribable tragedy. Children watching parents being tortured, then being tortured themselves. Parents forced to watch their children die first as additional psychological torture. Siblings clinging to each other while waiting their turn in the execution line. And many of these children, witnesses recount with astonishment, maintained supernatural courage. Children of 10, 12 years old refusing to apostatize, declaring, "I am a Christian," with a firm voice, dying singing. How? Because they had been discipled from birth to understand that following Jesus can cost everything. Their faith was not passively inherited. It was intentionally cultivated by parents who knew that their children might need it to die well. Agnes, or Inez, was only 12 or 13 years old. Details vary, but the consensus is that she was a young teenager. And she was stunningly beautiful, attracting the attention of the son of a Roman prefect who wanted to marry her off. When she refused, saying she was consecrated to Christ, the young man became obsessed, or heartbroken, depending on how generous you are with interpretation. His father, the prefect, tried to force her, marry or sacrifice to the gods. Agnes refused both. "I already have a lover," she is said to have declared, "more handsome than any earthly suitor." The prefect tried to humiliate her by exposing her naked in a public brothel. If she wouldn't be his wife, she would be a common prostitute. But tradition says that her hair miraculously grew, covering her body, and any man who tried to touch her was blinded or immediately repented. Finally, she was executed. Methods vary in the sources: beheading, burning at the stake, or stabbing in the throat. She died a virgin, a martyr, at the age of 12 to 13. And she became one of the most venerated saints of the early church. Patron saint of purity, young girls and brides. Why so much veneration? Because Agnes represented purity preserved at the utmost cost. Roman society said, "A woman's value lies in her sexuality. If not as a wife, then as a prostitute." Agnes responded, "A woman's value lies in her fidelity to Christ, and her body is not available to a system that treats her as a commodity." She was 12 years old and understood more about dignity than the adults around her. And Inez became a symbol not only of sexual purity, but of purity of conviction. Adults could rationalize, negotiate, find gray areas. "It's just a political gesture, God knows my heart." But a child like Inez saw things in black and white with disconcerting clarity. Either Jesus is Lord or he is not. There is no comfortable middle ground. And this simplicity, which some would call naivete, was profoundly prophetic. It exposed how many adult Christians had gradually compromised without realizing it, finding sophisticated justifications for small betrayals. A child martyr had no sophistication for self-deception. "I am a Christian" was total identity without compartmentalization. And this shamed and inspired adults. How many parents saw their 12-year-old daughter refuse apostasy while they themselves trembled in line thinking of giving in? How many strong men saw their daughter maintain the courage they were losing? Inez was a mirror showing half-hearted commitment. And Christian communities, after persecutions, especially exalted child martyrs, because they were living rebuke. If a child can do it, why can't you? It had nothing to do with age. It had everything to do with genuine faith versus performative faith. And children, without years of accumulated hypocrisy, often had purer faith. Embarrassing, but true. Cosmas and Damien were twin brothers, Christian physicians, some say teenagers, others young adults, sources vary, who practiced medicine for free in the name of Christ. They were called anargyroi, without money, without payment, because they refused to charge for treatments, citing "freely you have received, freely give." This made them beloved by the people, but problematic for the pagan medical establishment, economic competition, and religious authorities, who attributed cures to Christ, not to Asclepius, the god of medicine. During Diocletian's persecution, they were arrested. The governor tried to seduce them. "You are talented young men with a bright future. Just sacrifice pro forma and continue practicing medicine." They refused. They were tortured. Tradition mentions a series of miraculously failed execution attempts. Drowning, they floated. Fire, they didn't burn. Stoning, stones missed. Arrows, missed the target. Finally, decapitation worked. Their bodies were buried together, and the site became a healing sanctuary. Thousands made pilgrimages seeking miraculous cures from the martyr physicians. Cosmas and Damian became patrons of doctors, pharmacists, and surgeons. Why? Because they modeled medicine as a ministry, healing as worship, and profession as a vocation. They were not doctors who were also Christians. They were Christians whose faith was expressed through medicine. And this had subversive implications. It challenged a pagan medical system where healing was an expensive commodity accessible only to the rich. Cosmas and Damian democratized healthcare, treating the poor with the same excellence as the rich. Socialized Christian medicine won 700 years before public health systems, and they paid with their lives for subverting the medical economy. The execution of Cosmas and Damian during Diocletian's persecution was especially strategic. They were not just Christians, they were beloved public figures. Killing popular doctors who healed the poor for free risked popular revolt. But Diocletian was committed to total extermination. No exceptions, even for those considered useful. So they were publicly executed as a warning. Not even social usefulness saves you if you refuse to sacrifice. It was a lesson in imperial priorities. Religious loyalty trumps practical contribution. And this exposed the perversity of the system. The empire claimed to value piety, civic duty, and the common good. But when doctors who embodied the common good refused to worship the emperor as a god, the empire killed them. Naked hypocrisy. And Christians saw clearly. Rome didn't want good citizens, it wanted submissive subjects. You could be a violent criminal as long as you sacrificed to the gods, but you couldn't be a holy doctor if you refused. Values were inverted, and the death of Cosmas and Damian crystallized this. They became symbols not only of Christian medicine, but of professionalism with integrity, doing excellent work, and maintain firm convictions, do not compromise principles for convenience or survival. Question for today. Are you a Christian doctor, a Christian lawyer, a Christian teacher, or are you a Christian who practices medicine, law, or teaches? The difference seems subtle, but it's everything. Cosmas and Damian were second. Christian identity defined everything, including profession. And when profession conflicted with faith, faith prevailed. Child martyrs were often described with language of innocence, purity, uncontaminated by adult compromises, faith uncorrupted by cynicism. And there was theology behind it. Children represented the ideal of the kingdom that Jesus taught. Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 18:3. So when a child died confessing Christ, it was as if the kingdom itself was being martyred. Not that adults were less valuable, but children had special symbolism. They represented unrealized potential, all the decades of service that would never happen, the family they would never form, the ministry they would never have. It was a total waste from a human point of view. But Christian theology reversed this. Child martyrs did not lose potential, performed maximum potential. The supreme purpose of human life is not longevity, career, family, good as they are. It is to glorify God. And a child who dies confessing Christ at age 12 fulfilled that purpose more completely than an adult who lives to 90 but never risks anything for Jesus. It was a radical inversion of values. Society said, a long and productive life is success. Christianity responded, faithfulness to Christ is success regardless of duration. And child martyrs proved theology because they died early but arrived in glory first. The last shall be first. Teenage martyrs were particularly impressive because they were at an age to question, doubt, rebel, but not against Christ, against a system that demanded betrayal of Christ. Adolescence is when identity is forged, where you decide who you will be, independent of your parents. And these teenagers, Agnes, Prisca, Ignatius of Antioch mentions young people in letters, dozens of others, chose Christian identity so firmly that they preferred to die rather than abandon it. It wasn't faith passively inherited from parents, it was faith personally appropriated. And that had tremendous apologetic power. Pagan critics said, "Christianity is family brainwashing. Children just repeat what parents say." But teenage martyrs refuted that. They were at an age to rebel against their parents if they wanted to. Rome even offered an easy way out. Apostate now, save your life. Your parents will understand. But teenagers refused even when parents begged them to yield, like Perpetua's father. So it wasn't blind obedience to parents, it was deep personal conviction. And the proof was in being willing to die for it. How many teenagers today would die for anything? Most can't even commit to a hobby for 6 months, but those teenagers of old committed themselves to Christ unto death. It makes modern teenagers seem superficial. With exceptions, of course, there are teenage martyrs today in persecuted countries. But the general pattern, deep conviction, is rare in modern youth. It wasn't rare then. Why? Perhaps because they were intensely discipled, perhaps because the culture was more serious, perhaps because facing persecution forces rapid maturity, probably a combination of everything. Christian communities viewed the death of children as a particularly precious martyrdom, not because children were better than adults, but because they represented a purer sacrifice. An adult dying had lived decades, perhaps sinned considerably, perhaps compromised at times. But a child, they had a whole life ahead of them, unlimited potential, relative innocence. To sacrifice all that at age 12 was a perfect offering. And there was a theological parallel with Isaac. Abraham offering his only begotten son, God providing a substitute. But with child martyrs there was no substitute. They were a complete sacrifice. And this echoed the sacrifice of Christ, the spotless Lamb. So liturgically, child martyrs were celebrated with special reverence. Their relics were treasures, their tombs sanctuaries, their names invoked in prayers. Not idolatry, always through Christ, but veneration as supreme heroes of the faith. And parents who lost children to martyrdom were simultaneously devastated and honored. Devastated by the obvious loss, honored because their child had achieved ultimate glory. It was mourning mixed with a strange pride, pain with hope. "My son is with Christ" was not a cliché. It was a concrete theological reality that endured through unbearable pain. And the community surrounded these parents, assuring them that they were not alone, that their loss was not in vain, that their son would be remembered forever. And child martyrs were venerated as saints quickly, often faster than adults. Why? Because a child's holiness was less debatable. With adults there was always complexity, known sins, questionable decisions, difficult personalities. But children were seen through a lens of purity. Not that they were perfect, the theology of original sin applied, but they hadn't accumulated decades of obvious flaws. So canonization, an informal process in the early centuries, later formalized, was almost automatic. Agnes at 12, Prisca at 13, other children whose names we don't even know, all saints. And this created accessible models of holiness. An adult could say, "I'm too flawed to be a saint." But a holy child would respond, "Holiness is not the absence of sin, only Jesus had that. It's faithfulness at a decisive moment. A child can be faithful, you can too." It was the democratization of holiness. It didn't require decades of monastic penance, sophisticated theology, or proven miracles. I needed one thing to say, "I am a Christian," and not deny it when pressed. A child could do that. Therefore, you can too. And this accessibility of holiness through child martyrs inspired multitudes. If a 12-year-old child is holy, what excuse does a 40-year-old adult have for living lukewarmly? None. Holy children were both a source of reproof and an inspiration. Narratives of child martyrs emphasized purity and innocence also for apologetic rhetorical reasons. When Christians wrote to pagan audiences defending their faith, they highlighted children. You kill innocent children who have never harmed anyone. What threat does a 10-year-old child represent to the Roman Empire? What wickedness is this? It was a devastating moral argument. Pagans could rationalize killing adult Christians. They refused to sacrifice, they are traitors. But killing children, even conscientious pagans found it disturbing. And some accounts mention exactly that. Crowds that shouted for Christian blood fell silent when children were executed. Because seeing a child die awakens something fundamentally human, protection of the vulnerable. And when the empire systematically killed vulnerable people, it exposed its own monstrosity. So Christian narratives of child martyrs were apologetic weapons. See what kind of system you defend, one that kills innocents for refusing to lie. And it worked. Countless conversions occurred because pagans watched a child die courageously and thought, "This isn't right. I need to understand what she had that we don't." That child martyr preached a sermon that a theologian couldn't, a sermon of innocence overcoming injustice, weakness shaming power, purity exposing corruption. And that sermon resonated in consciences, planted doubts, germinated questions that eventually led to Christ. Thank you for walking with me through these powerful stories of soldiers, women, children, and leaders who chose Christ above all else. May these testimonies strengthen your faith and inspire daily courage. Have a blessed night, rest well, and we'll meet again here at Christian World for Bedtime. See you soon.